were shaking so bad I almost ran a red light outside of Tulsa. It was my sister-in-law's voice on the phone that did it. Not crying, not screaming. Flat. The way people talk when they've already processed something terrible and they're just delivering the facts now. You need to come home, Nate. I don't know how to tell you this. Just come home. I'd been in Dallas 3 days for a pipeline safety inspection contract. 6 hours away, I'd left my daughter Chloe with my wife Diane's family, the way I had 100 times before. Chloe was 8. She liked strawberry Pop-Tarts and building Lego cities on the living room floor, and she'd recently decided she was going to be a marine biologist when she grew up, because dolphins were, in her exact words, objectively the best animals ever created. She was terrified of the dark, had been since she was 4, when she got accidentally locked in the supply closet at her preschool for 40 minutes before anyone noticed. She still slept with 2 nightlights and a lamp on a timer. I'd never once given her grief about it. It wasn't a quirk to fix, it was just part of who she was. My brother-in-law Darren knew that. Everyone in Diane's family knew that. I found out later he'd made it a game. My sister-in-law April was the one who called me. She'd driven over to Diane's mother's house to drop off some things and heard Chloe screaming from the backyard. Not playing screaming. The other kind. The kind that makes your stomach drop before your brain even processes the sound. When I called April back and she finally told me what she'd seen through the window, I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there for 4 minutes without moving. The surveillance footage from the nanny cam I'd installed in the den, the one that covered the hallway leading to the basement, was uploading to my phone as we spoke. I watched it twice. Then I called my younger brother Caleb. I need you at Mom's old house in Broken Arrow right now. Don't ask me anything, just go. I'm already getting my keys, he said. I didn't tell him why. Didn't have the words yet. The drive from Dallas to Broken Arrow is 5 hours and 40 minutes on a clear day with no stops. I made it in 4 hours and 55. I know that because I looked at my phone when I pulled onto the street and the timestamp was there. Permanent, like the rest of what I was about to see. Diane had inherited her mother's house when her mother passed 2 years earlier. We'd been using it as a kind of extended family gathering spot. Diane's brother Darren had essentially moved himself in over the past 8 months, which I'd raised concerns about and been told I was being controlling. Diane's cousin Brittany and her husband Joel had been staying there too, temporarily, supposedly, for the past 3 weeks. That house had become a revolving door for Diane's family, and I'd been too focused on work to understand what that actually meant for my daughter. I parked 2 houses down. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Something my father told me once about never walking into a room until you know what's in it. Caleb texted me, "I'm here, Nate. Man. You need to get here. CPS is already on the way." A neighbor called. I'm outside. I walked up the driveway and Caleb met me on the front lawn. My brother is 31, works in logistics, not someone who rattles easy. He was rattled. His jaw was tight and he was holding his phone like he might throw it. "Chloe's okay," he said first. That was the first thing out of his mouth. "She's inside. She's with the neighbor lady from across the street, Miss Patricia. I'm going to need you to take a breath before I tell you the rest." I didn't take a breath. "Tell me." He told me. Darren had taken Chloe to the basement. The basement of that house is unfinished. Concrete walls, one bare bulb that hadn't worked in 2 years. Boxes and old furniture stacked along the walls. No windows. Chloe had been down there, door locked from the outside, but somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour before the neighbor heard her through the side yard fence and called it in. Diane was in the house when it happened. She'd been in the living room watching television. I walked inside. Caleb stayed close behind me. Patricia, the neighbor, was sitting on the old floral couch with her arm around my daughter, and she looked up at me with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. It was the face of someone who needed me to understand the full weight of what she was about to hand over. She was maybe 65, white-haired, wearing gardening gloves she hadn't taken off. She'd climbed over the fence. She'd gotten Chloe out through the back when she heard where the screaming was coming from, and she'd waited with her while Caleb drove over. Chloe saw me and came apart. She'd been holding herself together, the way kids do when they're with strangers, and then she saw my face and she just fell into me. She was shaking, her face was wet and blotchy, and she had a scratch on her forearm from something in the dark. "Daddy, I couldn't find the door," she kept saying. I couldn't find the door. It was so dark. I held her, and I didn't say a word. There wasn't anything to say. I just held her until the shaking slowed down. Patricia told me what she'd heard. She'd been deadheading her roses along the fence line when the screaming started. She said at first she thought it was a television, but it didn't stop, and it had the wrong quality to it, too desperate, too raw. She'd looked through a gap in the fence slats and seen the basement door on the outside of the house latched shut. She'd called 911 before she even climbed over. She told me she was sorry she hadn't called sooner. I told her she'd done exactly right. Chloe fell asleep on the couch 40 minutes later, Patricia's hand on her back. She flinched in her sleep. Twice. The police were already there. Darren had been detained in the driveway. Diane was sitting in the back of a patrol car, not handcuffed yet, just sitting, arms crossed, talking to an officer through the window with this expression on her face that I recognized from 3 years of increasingly difficult arguments. The expression that said whatever was happening was being done to her. Brittany and Joel had apparently left before anyone arrived. That came out later. A detective, a woman named Torres, asked to speak with me separately. She walked me through what the first responding officer had observed. She told me that when they arrived, Darren had been standing in the kitchen, and that Diane had initially told the officer the basement door had accidentally latched in the wind. I pulled out my phone. I showed Detective Torres the nanny cam footage. There was no wind. The footage showed Darren walking Chloe to the basement door. It showed him opening it, guiding her inside. It showed the latch going over. It showed him walking back to the kitchen. The timestamp said the door had been latched for 53 minutes before the 911 call came in. Detective Torres watched it twice without saying a word. Then she looked at me with a different kind of expression than she'd had a moment before. "How long has this camera been installed?" 7 months, I said. "Are there others?" There were 4. I'd installed them in September, after Chloe told me that Uncle Darren had made her stand in the corner for an hour while he and Diane watched a movie, and that Mommy had told her she was overreacting when she cried about it. I didn't know what I was documenting. I just knew something felt wrong in that house, and I traveled enough that I couldn't be there to watch it myself, and my gut wouldn't let me leave without doing something. I gave Detective Torres access to all 4 feeds. 7 months of footage. She watched about 90 seconds of it on my phone before she excused herself to make a call. Later that night, Caleb drove me and Chloe to my parents' house in Jenks. Chloe slept in the back seat the whole way, mouth open, one hand curled under her cheek. My mother had made up the guest room with the blue quilt Chloe liked and had put a nightlight in every outlet and left the hall light on. My father sat with me in the kitchen while Caleb checked on Chloe. My father is not a man who talks a lot. He's a retired iron worker from Sepulpa, 64 years old. Quiet in the way people get quiet when they've spent a lifetime doing physical labor and they've earned the right not to fill silence with noise. He poured 2 cups of coffee and he sat down across from me and he said, "Tell me what you need." I told him I didn't know yet. "Then we'll sit until you do." We sat for a long time. What I needed, I eventually understood, was to make sure this never touched Chloe again. Not Darren. Not Diane. Not Brittany and Joel and whoever else had been in that house treating my daughter like a problem to be managed while I was out of state paying for everything. I need to back up and explain Diane, because what happened next only makes sense if you understand who she'd become over the previous 3 years. We'd gotten married when Chloe was 18 months old. It had been a difficult pregnancy, unplanned, and we'd done our best to build something solid around it. For about 2 years we did. Then Diane's mother died and left her the house and some money. Not a life-changing amount, but enough to feel like a foundation. And something shifted in Diane after that. The grief did something, or maybe the money did, or maybe those things just revealed something that had always been there. She started spending more, started pulling away from the routines we'd built together, started talking about Chloe differently in this flat, clinical way that I kept hoping would pass. 6 months before that night, Diane had told me she wanted a divorce, told me she felt trapped. I'd suggested counseling, which she agreed to and then attended once before canceling all subsequent appointments. She'd started consulting with a family attorney whose name I found on a notepad she didn't know I'd seen. She'd started what I could only call a quiet campaign to establish, in the eyes of everyone around us, that I was difficult to live with, controlling, absent, more invested in my work than my family. I'd been trying not to see it for what it was, trying to believe it was grief and stress and nothing more permanent than that. The night Chloe told me about the corner incident, the one that made me install the cameras, I'd gone back to Diane with it directly. Diane had said Chloe was being dramatic, that Darren had asked her to stand in the corner for 5 minutes, not an hour, and that Chloe had a habit of exaggerating. That I was catastrophizing, that this was exactly the behavior that made things so hard between us. I'd backed down. I hate that I backed down. I installed the cameras and I backed down from the conversation, and I told myself I was being strategic. But the truth is, I was still trying to keep the peace in a house where peace had already quietly left. The footage told a different story than the one I'd been sold. I didn't watch all 7 months of it that night. I watched enough. There was footage of Chloe being sent to sit alone in the basement utility room, a different space from where she'd been locked that evening, for smaller infractions, talking too loud, spilling a drink, crying. Each time, Darren made the call and Diane didn't object. In one clip from February, Diane walked past the closed door while Chloe was in there and didn't open it. Just walked past. I watched that clip 4 times. The attorney I called the next morning was a family law specialist named Harrigan, who came recommended by a colleague of mine. I brought the footage. I brought the police report. I brought 7 months of cloud-backed recordings with timestamps and GPS metadata confirming I'd been out of state on every date Chloe had been left in that house overnight. Harrigan watched 12 minutes of footage and said, "This isn't a custody case. This is a criminal case with a custody component. You need to call the DA's office today." I already had an appointment. The assistant district attorney I met with was a compact, serious woman in her early 40s who went through my documentation without expression for 25 minutes before she looked up. "Your brother-in-law has a prior," she said. "Misdemeanor assault, 2019. That, combined with this footage and the duration of confinement, moves this from child neglect into child abuse. The door was latched from the outside. That's false imprisonment of a minor." "And my wife," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. "Your wife was in the house. She was aware. We need to establish she knew the child was down there, which your footage appears to support." She paused. "We'll be filing charges." I asked about Brittany and Joel, who'd left before the police arrived. She told me that was a separate matter, but that their departure would be factored into the investigation. I asked about Chloe. "Your daughter is safe with you. Given the charges being filed and the evidence you provided, I'll be recommending to the family court that you have sole emergency custody immediately. I don't anticipate that being challenged." I walked out of that building into a June afternoon and sat on a bench for a few minutes just to feel the sun. Over the next 3 weeks, things moved in the way these things move when there's footage and documentation and a clear record. Darren was charged with false imprisonment of a minor and child abuse. He'd had 2 jobs, one of them under the table for a landscaping company, while collecting disability benefits from an old back injury claim. That information, which I hadn't been looking for but found in the course of going through everything, made its way to the appropriate agency. His benefits were suspended pending investigation. Diane's attorney entered a not guilty plea on her behalf and attempted to position her as a passive bystander who hadn't fully understood what her brother was doing. The footage made that argument hard to sustain. There was a clip from April in which Diane and Darren discussed in the kitchen whether the basement had been too much too soon and whether they should try a different approach next time. That clip, per Harrigan, was the one that shifted Diane from a difficult custody case into a criminal defendant. Brittany and Joel hired their own attorneys and cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. What they offered in return was a set of text messages between Diane and Darren going back 8 months. Conversations that outlined, in plain language, their shared belief that Chloe needed to be, as Diane put it, broken of her dependency on me before the divorce was finalized, that if Chloe came to see me as unavailable and unreliable, and if her behavior became difficult enough to manage, the court would be less likely to grant me primary custody. The dark, the isolation, the repeated small incidents that never quite rose to the level of a single dramatic event. It wasn't random, it was a strategy. I read those texts sitting at my parents' kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night with my coffee going cold, and I had to stop twice and just breathe. Because the thing about reading something like that isn't the anger, though the anger is there. It's the grief. It's reading evidence that someone you shared a life with had decided your child was a tactical problem to be solved. Chloe's pediatrician had documented everything from her examination the evening of the incident. Old bruising on her shin that we'd been told was from a playground fall, a healing abrasion on her upper arm. The pediatrician submitted her notes to the investigation without being asked. The criminal proceedings took most of the following year. I won't go through all of it in detail, because this isn't really about the legal process. What I can tell you is that Darren was convicted on both counts and sentenced to 9 years. He'll serve at least 6 before he's eligible for parole, and his prior conviction was factored into sentencing. Diane pled guilty to child endangerment and 1 count of conspiracy after the text messages came in, and she was sentenced to 4 years, with the possibility of probation after 2 if she completed a court-mandated intervention program. Her parental rights were not automatically terminated, but were suspended pending her completing that program and demons going, and I was granted sole legal and physical custody of Chloe immediately and permanently. Brittany and Joel received suspended sentences with probation and community service. Their own children were briefly reviewed by Child Protective Services and returned to their home with mandatory family monitoring. The family court judge, a straightforward man in his 60s who had clearly seen too much to be surprised by any of it, signed the sole custody order on a Tuesday morning in March. He looked at Chloe's most recent school report and her therapist's notes, and he looked at my documentation, and he said, "This child has a parent who is paying attention. That matters more than most people understand." I'd started therapy with Chloe the week after the incident. A child trauma specialist in Tulsa named Dr. Abrams, who had a calm, unhurried manner that Chloe responded to immediately. I took Chloe 3 times a week for the first 2 months, then twice a week. The nightmares came less frequently. The flinching in her sleep started to ease. She wouldn't go into any room with the lights off for a long time, and I didn't push it. I put night lights in every room of our apartment, even the bathroom, even the kitchen. I didn't care. One evening in November, about 5 months after the incident, Chloe came into the kitchen while I was making dinner and said, "Dad, can I tell you something?" "Always," I said. She climbed up on the counter stool. "I'm not as scared of the dark as I used to be." I kept stirring the pasta. "Yeah? I mean, I still don't like it, but it doesn't feel like it's going to eat me anymore." "That sounds like progress," I said. She considered this. Doctor, Abrams says progress doesn't mean you forget. It means you get bigger than the thing that scared you." I turned off the burner and I looked at my daughter for a long moment. 8 years old, sitting on a kitchen stool, delivering wisdom she'd worked genuinely hard for. "That's exactly right," I said. "We moved to a new apartment in August before the school year started. 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, lots of windows, a complex with a pool that Chloe had immediately identified as the deciding factor. No basement. She'd asked about that specifically when we looked at the listing. I told her there wasn't one. She'd nodded once seriously, like that settled it. The apartment complex was in a different school district, which I'd chosen deliberately. New school, new start. No one who knew the story unless Chloe decided to tell it. She made 2 friends in the first week. She joined the after-school art club. She came home the 3rd Friday of the semester with a painting she'd done of 2 dolphins, side by side, jumping over a wave. She hung it on the refrigerator herself. Caleb came over for dinner most Sunday nights. He'd been the one to stay with Chloe at my parents' house during the worst of the legal proceedings, the weeks when I was in and out of offices and courtrooms, and I needed to know she was somewhere safe and loved. He'd taken her to get ice cream 14 times in 3 months. She'd told me, very seriously, that Uncle Caleb had terrible taste in flavors, but that she forgave him. The last piece of the legal process came in December. Diane's attorney filed a motion requesting supervised visitation, contingent on her completing the first phase of her intervention program. Harrigan called me when it came in. "You have the right to object," she said. "You also have the right not to." I thought about it for 3 days. I talked to Dr. Abda. What to do, but about Chloe, about where she was in her progress, about what exposure to Diane, even supervised, even limited, would mean for a child who was 8 years old and finally sleeping through the night. Dr. Abrams said, "The question isn't what Diane deserves. The question isn't what Chloe needs." I filed the objection. The motion was denied pending further review. That night, after Chloe went to bed, I sat on the back balcony of our apartment for a long time. The complex was quiet. There were lights on in windows across the courtyard. Families doing whatever families do at 10 o'clock at night. I could hear Chloe's sound machine through the sliding door. The ocean sounds she'd chosen herself, waves going in and out. My father had called that afternoon, just to check in. We'd talked for about 20 minutes, mostly about the job he was helping a neighbor with, a deck rebuild in the backyard. Near the end of the call, he'd said simply, "She's going to be okay, Nate." "I know," I said. "You know how I know?" "How?" "Because every time I've seen her in the past 6 months, she looks more like herself." He was right. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Not the court dates or the sentencing or the documentation that had, brick by brick, dismantled the story Diane and Darren had been trying to build. All of that mattered. All of that was necessary. But what mattered most was what I saw in my daughter's face every morning when she came out to breakfast and sat across from me and told me about whatever dream she'd had or whatever thing she was thinking about. The easy, ordinary shape of a child who felt safe. I'd failed to see what was happening for longer than I should have. That's the part I carry. I installed the cameras when something felt wrong, and that turned out to be the right call. But I should have trusted that feeling sooner. I should have listened better to the things Chloe told me and given less weight to the explanations that were designed to make me doubt what I was hearing. If there is one thing I would say to anyone watching this who recognizes something in what I've described, it's this. Children don't have the vocabulary to tell you exactly what's wrong. They tell you in the only ways they know how. Behavior, flinching, the specific fear that shows up in their eyes when someone's name is mentioned. When a child tries to tell you something, the cost of listening is nothing. The cost of not listening can be everything. If you suspect a child is being harmed, call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4454. They're available 24 hours a day. If you're in a situation yourself and need support, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. Chloe is 9 now. She just started a marine biology summer camp at the aquarium in Tulsa, which she's been asking about for 2 years. And last week she came home and told me, with complete authority, that she'd held a sea urchin and it was, in her exact words, spiky but not scary. I told her that was pretty much the best description of a sea urchin I'd ever heard. She told me she knew. I think about the camera a lot, not as a piece of technology, but as a decision. The moment I screwed that thing into the corner of the den wall because something in my gut said pay attention, I made a choice to trust myself over the more comfortable explanation. That choice is the reason my daughter is okay. There's a version of this story where I don't do that, where I keep swallowing the doubt, keep accepting the easy answers, keep telling myself I'm being paranoid and difficult and too suspicious for my own good. I almost lived in that version. For a long time, I was halfway inside it, and the truth I have to sit with is that Chloe paid for every month I spent talking myself out of what I already knew. What I've come to understand is that doing right by the people you love isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks exactly like what Caleb did, dropping everything and driving, no questions, just I'm already getting my keys. Sometimes it looks like Patricia, 65 years old in gardening gloves, climbing a fence because a child screaming didn't sound right, and she decided that was enough of a reason to act. Neither of them had a plan. They had a clear sense of what mattered, and the willingness to move toward it. That's what I think of now when I hear the word character. Not the version that shows up when things are easy. The version that shows up when showing up costs something. The intelligence piece, and I mean the kind that matters, not test scores or credentials, is what saved Chloe legally. 7 months of footage. Team stumped, cloud-backed, metadata intact. I didn't know what I was building when I built it, but I'd learned enough from years of safety work to understand that documentation is the difference between a feeling and a fact, between an accusation and a case. The moments when I'd felt like I was overreacting, those turned out to be the moments I was paying the closest attention. Paying attention is a skill. It requires practice. It requires believing your own observations even when someone is working hard to make you doubt them. And Chloe, what she did in that family courtroom, standing up and saying clearly that she didn't want Diane, called her mother anymore, that her family was the people who kept her safe. She was 8 years old. She hadn't read anything about boundaries or self-advocacy or reclaiming your narrative. She'd just been through something terrible and come out the other side with a working understanding of what she deserved. That's not something I gave her. That came from inside her, but I think it grew in the space I tried to hold for her. The space that said, what you feel is real. What happened to you matters. You are worth protecting. The hardest part of this whole thing isn't the legal process or the anger or even the grief of watching a marriage turn into evidence. The hardest part is accepting that I could have seen it sooner, that I did see it in pieces, and I kept choosing the less painful interpretation. I'm not going to carry that as permanent guilt, but I carry it as a lesson I intend to keep. When something feels wrong about how someone is treating a person you love, especially a child, especially one who doesn't have the words to tell you exactly what's happening, the cost of investigating is nothing. The cost of not investigating is something you don't want to find out. Chloe held a sea urchin last week and told me it was spiky but not scary. I think about that more than anything else, about how that's the whole story really, about how that's what we're all trying to get to, not the absence of hard things, but the size to hold them without being swallowed.